A single touch in the calm of the living room broke the unspoken barriers between us, changing everything in an instant. That moment is as vivid in my recollection as if it occurred yesterday. I was a mother, a wife, and the glue that kept everything together. Or so I thought. It's odd how quickly we feel things are perfect, right up to the moment we understand they are not. It was a typical evening at home. My husband Ethan had been working late again. I'd grown used to his absences, convincing myself that he was simply working hard to provide for our family. But deep down, I could feel the distance growing between us. Ethan hadn't looked at me with that sparkle in his eye in years. It was as though we'd become strangers, orbiting around each other, without ever truly connecting. That night, as I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of wine in my hand, I thought about the life I'd built, the life I was now questioning. My son Lara had just turned 19 and was starting his sophomore year at college. He'd been staying with us for the summer, but unlike the distant relationship I shared with Ethan, Lara and I had grown close, maybe closer than most mothers and sons. I'd always prided myself on being his confidant, the one person he could come to with anything. But something had changed in Lara recently. He'd grown distant, more guarded, and I found myself aching for the connection we'd once had. I wanted him to talk to me, to open up, to let me in like he used to. Maybe it was selfish, but in a way, Lara filled a void that Ethan never could. One evening, Lara came home later than usual, the faint scent of cologne and something else, something unfamiliar clinging to him. I looked up as he walked through the door, his face shadowed with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Hey, Mom," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Hey, hun," I replied, my voice catching long day. He nodded, sliding his bag off his shoulder and setting it down. "Yeah, just needed some air, I guess." There was something in his tone that made me pause a heaviness. He didn't look at me directly, instead fixing his gaze on the floor, his hands shoved deep into his pockets for a moment. I wanted to reach out to ask him what was wrong, but something held me back. But the story didn't end there. The following days were a strange blur of silent exchanges and half-formed thoughts. Ethan was rarely home, and when he was, he seemed distracted, his mind elsewhere. It was as if the foundation of our family was shifting beneath my feet, and I couldn't find my balance. Ethan, who used to be my partner in everything, was now a stranger. I'd never thought I'd feel so alone in my own home. One evening, after Ethan had left for a business dinner that I suspected was something else entirely, I decided to confront Lara. He was sitting on the back porch, staring out at the darkened yard, lost in thought. I walked over, settling beside him on the steps, the cool night air sending a shiver down my spine. "Lara," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are you okay?" He looked over at me, his eyes shadowed and intense. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just studied my face as though searching for something I don't know. "Mom," he finally said, his voice tinged with an emotion I couldn't quite place sometimes. "I just feel like I don't belong here, like I'm out of place." The weight of his words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd never thought that Lara would feel that way. Not in our home, not with me. I reached over, placing a hand on his shoulder, and felt the tension in his muscles. "You will always belong here," I murmured, "no matter what." He sighed a long, shaky exhale that seemed to carry the weight of everything he hadn't said. "Thanks, Mom," he replied, his voice barely a whisper, and for a moment we just sat there in silence, the unspoken words hanging between us. But the silence didn't last long. Days turned into weeks, and as the summer crept closer to an end, I felt the strain on my marriage deepen. Ethan was gone more than he was home, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something from me. I'd caught glimpses of messages on his phone, texts from a name I didn't recognize. Mel. When I asked him about it, he brushed me off, telling me it was just a work colleague, that I was imagining things. But I knew better. I knew when something wasn't right. The realization hit me slowly, like a series of puzzle pieces falling into place. Ethan was cheating on me. I didn't have proof, not yet, but my intuition screamed it. He'd grown cold, distant, uninterested in me or our family, and the irony was, in the middle of this mess, the only person who seemed to care was Lara. My own son had become my lifeline, the one constant in a sea of uncertainty. One evening, after Ethan had left for another late night at work, Lara and I sat down for dinner. The house felt empty without Ethan's presence, but in a way it was almost a relief. I didn't have to pretend, didn't have to keep up the facade of the perfect family. No one noticed my mood right away, his gaze softening as he looked at me across the table. "You okay, Mom?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I hesitated, the weight of everything I'd been holding back, pressing down on me. But this was Lara. He deserved to know the truth. "No," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think your father is seeing someone else for a moment." Lara just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then, without a word, he reached across the table, taking my hand in his. The warmth of his touch grounded me, reminded me that I wasn't alone, even if it felt that way. "Mom," he said softly, his eyes locked on mine. "You don't deserve that. You deserve so much more." His words sent a shiver through me, a strange mixture of comfort and something else, something I couldn't quite name. I squeezed his hand, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill over. "Thank you, Lara," I whispered. "You have no idea how much that means to me." That night, as I lay in bed staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the memory of his words, of the way he'd looked at me, his gaze filled with something I couldn't quite understand. In that moment, I realized just how much I needed him, how much he'd become my anchor, my reason for holding on. But things didn't end there. If anything, they only got more complicated. The days that followed were filled with a strange tension that I couldn't quite explain. Lara and I spent more time together than we ever had before. We'd talk for hours about anything and everything, our dreams, our fears, our regrets. He'd tell me about the struggles he was facing at school, the pressure to be perfect, to live up to everyone's expectations, and in return, I'd share my own fears, my own doubts, the pain of a marriage that was slowly falling apart, and somewhere along the way, something shifted between us. It was subtle at first, a lingering glance, a touch that lasted just a bit too long, a shared smile that seemed to hold more meaning than it should. I knew it was wrong, knew that I was crossing a line, but I couldn't help myself. Lara was there for me in a way that Ethan never had been, and in my loneliness, I clung to him like a lifeline. One evening, as we sat together on the couch watching a movie, I felt his hand brush against mine. It was a small gesture, innocent on the surface, but the spark that shot through me was anything but innocent. I glanced over at him, our eyes meeting, and in that moment, I knew that things would never be the same. The boundaries between us had blurred, and there was no going back. I kept replaying that moment on the couch, over and over. It haunted me, the way Lara's hand had brushed against mine, lingering for just a second too long. An innocent gesture, maybe, but something about it left me restless. It was as though we'd crossed a line, unspoken but undeniable. Part of me wanted to forget it, to pretend it had never happened. But every time I tried, the memory slipped back in as persistent as my own heartbeat. Things between Ethan and myself had cooled, and he appeared hardly aware of my presence. Days progressed into weeks, with missed meals, one-sided chats, and ignored messages. I found myself reaching out to Lara more and more because I needed someone who noticed me and cared. As I turned to face him, he did the same. I hadn't realized how much he'd been battling, feeling caught in the tension that had seeped into every corner of our home. We were both lonely, both hurting, and our pain seemed to bind us together in ways I hadn't expected. One evening, as we sat at the dinner table, the air between us was thick with silence. Ethan was out again, no surprise there, and I could feel the weight of everything that was left unsaid hanging over us. I looked at Lara, his face cast in shadows from the dim kitchen light, and felt a pang of guilt mixed with something else. Something I didn't. I want to name. I just don't get it, Mom, Lara finally said, breaking the silence. How can he just leave you like this? Doesn't he see what he has? I didn't know how to respond. I'd asked myself the same question too many times. I don't know, Lara. I whispered, my voice, barely audible. Maybe I'm just not enough for him anymore. Lara's expression darkened, his gaze intense as he looked at me. That's not true. You're more than enough. He just doesn't see it. His words hit me harder than I expected, filling me with a strange sense of validation. I couldn't remember the last time someone had looked at me that way, with that kind of appreciation. That kind of care Ethan certainly hadn't. And in that moment, sitting there in the quiet of the kitchen, I felt a warmth spread through me, the kind I hadn't felt in years. Without thinking, I reached over, placing my hand over his. It was supposed to be a comforting gesture, a simple touch between mother and son. But as soon as our skin connected, I felt an electric current pass between us. Lara didn't pull away, and neither did I. We just sat there, our hands intertwined, the silence growing heavier with each passing second. But I couldn't let myself get lost in this. Not like this. I pulled my hand back, my heart racing, the weight of what had just happened, pressing down on me. I'm sorry. Lara, I stammered, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. I didn't mean to. He shook his head, his gaze never leaving mine. You don't have to apologize. Mom, it's okay. The look in his eyes told me that he understood, that he wasn't judging me, and somehow that made it even harder. I stood up abruptly, mumbling something about needing to clean up, needing to busy myself, anything to break the tension. I could feel his eyes on me as I moved around the kitchen, my hands shaking as I washed the dishes, my mind racing. The days that followed were filled with a strange tension between us, one that neither of us dared to acknowledge. I'd catch him looking at me out of the corner of his eye, his gaze lingering just a second too long. And every time I'd feel that same surge of warmth, that same rush of something forbidden. I knew it was wrong, knew that I should put an end to it. But the truth was, I didn't want to. I'd spent so many years feeling invisible, unwanted, unloved, and now for the first time I felt seen. One evening, as I was folding laundry in the living room, I heard the front door creak open. I looked up, expecting to see Ethan, but it was Lara. He'd been out with friends, but the look on his face told me that something was bothering him. Hey, Mom, he said, his voice soft as he closed the door behind him. Hey, Lara, I replied, trying to keep my tone light casual, but the tension was there, lingering just beneath the surface. Everything okay? He hesitated, glancing down at his feet before looking back up at me. Can we talk? I nodded, setting the laundry aside and patting the spot on the couch beside me. He sat down, his body close to mine, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him for a moment. Neither of us spoke, the silence stretching out between us, thick and heavy. I don't know how to say this. He finally murmured, his voice barely above a whisper, but I feel like I can't talk to anyone else about this. My heart raced as I looked at him, waiting, unsure of where this was going. You can talk to me, Lara. You know that. He nodded, taking a deep breath before continuing. It's just, I've been feeling things I don't understand, and I don't know who to talk to about it. I don't even know if I should be feeling this way. The vulnerability in his voice made my heart ache. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him that it was okay, that whatever he was feeling was normal, but deep down I knew that wasn't entirely true. I knew that the lines between us had started to blur, and I didn't know how to stop it. I reached over, placing a hand on his shoulder, and he leaned into my touch, his head resting against my shoulder. We sat like that for what felt like hours, wrapped in a silence that spoke louder than words ever could. I could feel his heart beat against my arm, feel the warmth of his breath against my neck, and I knew that things had gone too far. But there was no turning back now. As the days went on, the tension between us only grew. I found myself looking forward to the times we shared, the stolen glances, the fleeting touches that lasted just a little too long. It was like a dance, with each of us pushing the limits, seeing how far we could go until something broke, right in the center of it all. Ethan remained ignorant, too preoccupied with his own world to observe the tempest gathering right beneath his nose. One night, while I was preparing for bed, I heard a soft knock on my door. My heart skipped a beat, and I knew even before I opened it that it was Lara. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, but something inside me urged me to open it. He stood there, looking at me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Can't stop thinking about you, about us." The words hung in the air, heavy and charged, and for a moment I felt like I couldn't breathe. I knew this was wrong, knew that we were crossing a line that could never be uncrossed, but in that moment, I didn't care. I didn't care about the consequences, didn't care about what it meant. All I cared about was him and the way he looked at me like I was the only person in the world. "Lara," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We can't, this isn't." But the words died on my lips as he stepped closer, his hand reaching out to touch my face. His touch was gentle, tentative, as though he were afraid I might pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. I was too far gone too, caught up in the moment, in the feeling of being wanted, of being seen. He leaned in his face inches from mine, and I felt my heart pounding in my chest, the air between us crackling with tension. I knew that if I didn't stop this now, there would be no going back. But I was tired of holding back, tired of pretending that everything was okay when it wasn't. We stayed there frozen in that moment, our breaths mingling, our eyes locked. And in that second, I knew that everything was about to change. The days following that night were a blur, the memory of Lara standing there inches from me, his touch lingering on, my skin replayed over and over in my mind. I couldn't focus on anything else. Every glance, every accidental touch, every shared moment seemed to pull us further into something we both knew was wrong, but couldn't seem to stop. There was a current between us, something unspoken but undeniably real, that neither of us could deny any longer. I tried to keep myself busy, filling my days with mundane tasks, hoping that I could push these feelings down, bury them where they'd never resurface. But it was impossible. Every time I walked into a room and saw him there, I felt that familiar surge of warmth, a longing that left me breathless. It didn't help that Ethan was still absent, still caught up in whatever life he'd built outside of our home, leaving me to navigate this growing storm alone. One evening, after Ethan had left for yet another late-night work event, I found myself wandering into the living room where Lara was sitting. He was sprawled out on the couch, flipping through channels, his face a picture of calm. But when he looked up and saw me, something shifted. His gaze softened, his expression filling with an intensity that made my hair race. "Hey, Mom!" He said, his voice low and inviting. Couldn't sleep. I shook my head, suddenly feeling shy, though. I wasn't sure why. Just couldn't concentrate. "I think I wanted to check whether you were still awake." He grinned and patted the vacant area beside him. "Come sit. I was going to put on a movie." I paused, thinking maybe it would help you relax. But something about the warmth in his gaze made me feel protected, like if everything we were doing was perfectly okay. I walked over, settling down beside him, feeling the cushion shift as he scooted closer. He was so close, I could feel the heat radiating from him, a steady warmth that filled the space between us. We sat in silence as the movie played the glow from the screen, casting soft shadows across his face. I found myself sneaking glances at him, watching the way his eyes focused on the screen, the way his lips curved into a faint smile. Whenever something funny happened, I couldn't help but think about how much he'd grown, how much he'd changed, and how much he'd become. Something more than just my son. It was terrifying, thrilling, and completely confusing. As the movie progressed, I felt his hand slide over to rest on mine, his fingers intertwining with mine in a way that felt both comforting and forbidden. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let myself sink into the warmth of his touch, my heart pounding in my chest, as I felt his thumb gently stroke the back of my hand. I knew I should have stopped. It should have said something, done something to break the spell we were under, but I couldn't. I was too far gone too, caught up in the moment, in the feeling of being wanted, of being cared for. And when he turned to look at me, his eyes dark with something I dared not name, I felt a shiver run down my spine. Mom, he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I can't stop thinking about you, about us. The words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning, and I felt my heart skip a beat. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at him, my mind racing with those different emotions. Part of me wanted to run to end this before it went any further. But the other part of me, the part that had been so lonely, so starved for affection, wanted nothing more than to stay to see where this path would lead. Lara, I whispered, my voice trembling, we can't. But the words died on my lips as he leaned in his face inches from mine. I could feel his breath against my skin, warm and steady, and before I knew what was happening, his lips were on mine. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, as though he were afraid I might pull away, but I didn't. Instead, I found myself leaning into him, letting the kiss deepen, letting myself get lost in the moment. His hand moved to cup my face, his fingers brushing against my cheek in a way that made my heart flutter. The kiss was soft, slow, and filled with a tenderness I hadn't felt in years. It was everything I'd been craving, everything I'd been missing, and I couldn't bring myself to stop. I was too far gone too, caught up in the rush of emotions, in the feeling of finally being wanted, of finally being seen. As the kiss deepened, I felt his other hand move to my waist, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. My mind was a blur, every thought drowned out by the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against mine, the warmth of his touch, the softness of his lips. It was wrong. I knew that, but in that moment it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except for the two of us and the feeling of being truly, completely alive. But the kiss didn't last forever. Slowly, reluctantly, we pulled apart, both of us, breathless, our faces flushed with a mixture of excitement and guilt. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of what we'd done, settling over us like a heavy blanket. I could see the same confusion, the same fear in his eyes that I felt in my own, and I knew that this wasn't going to be easy, that this was only the beginning of a path we could never turn back from. I'm sorry, Mom, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't mean to. I don't know. I shook my head, reaching out to take his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin against mine. Lara, I murmured, my voice soft. You don't have to apologize. He wanted it too. The confession hung between us, a fragile truth that we both knew but had been too afraid to say out loud. I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me, as though a weight I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying had been lifted from my shoulders. We'd crossed a line, yes, but at least now we knew where we stood. At least now we didn't have to hide. But the relief was short-lived. In the days that followed, the tension between us only grew stronger. Every glance, every touch, every shared moment seemed to carry a weight that hadn't been there before. A sense of expectation that left us both on edge. I found myself looking forward to the moments we spent together, the stolen glances, the brief touches that lingered just a bit too long, and with Ethan still absent, still oblivious to the world around him, it felt as though we were living in a bubble, a world where it was just the two of us alone, and free to explore the feelings we'd both been hiding for so long. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a soft knock on my door. My heart skipped a beat, and I knew even before I opened it that it was Lara. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob, but something inside me urged me to open it. He stood there, looking at me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. Mom. He whispered his voice, barely audible. I can't stop thinking about that night about us. The words sent a thrill through me, a rush of excitement mixed with fear. I knew this was wrong, knew that we were treading dangerous ground, but I couldn't help myself. I stepped aside, letting him into the room, and as the door clicked shut behind him, I felt my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing with anticipation. We stood there facing each other, the silence thick with tension. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the warmth of his presence, and in that moment, everything else faded away. He reached out his hand, brushing against my cheek, and I leaned into his touch, closing my eyes as I felt his lips press softly against mine. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative as though he were testing the waters. But as our lips met, I felt a surge of emotions I hadn't felt in years, a rush of warmth that left me breathless, my heart racing, our bodies swayed together, melting into each other's embrace, lost in the intensity of our connectes. Time stood still as we surrendered to the moment, our lips moving in perfect harmony. The world receded, every worry and fear fading into insignificance. Our hearts beat as one lost in each other's eyes, our love shining brighter than anything else. But reality came crashing back, and with it a wave of guilt. We pulled apart, both of us, breathless, our faces flushed with a mixture of excitement and shame. I knew that this couldn't go on, knew that we were walking a dangerous path, but in that moment I didn't care. All I cared about was how he made me feel and how he looked at me, like if I were the only person in the world. We both knew it was wrong, but nothing else mattered. We were both too deep into the pleasure of the forbidden to ponder the repercussions. The days after that night were a whirlwind of emotions. Every time I saw Lara, every time our eyes met or our hands brushed, it was as if a spark ignited something within me, something that refused to fade no matter how hard I tried. But the reality of what we'd done was starting to settle in, and I could feel the weight of it pressing down on me, a constant reminder that we were dancing on the edge of something we couldn't control. Lara and I barely spoke about what had happened, each of us trapped in our own thoughts, caught between desire and guilt. Ethan remained oblivious, wrapped up in his own world, completely unaware of the secret that was growing like a shadow between us. I felt a strange mixture of relief and shame every time I looked at him, knowing that he had no idea what was happening right under his nose. One evening, after a long day of pretending everything was normal, I found myself in the kitchen, washing dishes and staring blankly out the window. The house was quiet, Ethan's still out for some business dinner that I'd long stopped questioning. I heard footsteps behind me, and I knew without turning around that it was Lara. His presence was as familiar to me now as my own heartbeat, and I could feel the tension building. As he approached, he came to stand beside me, reaching out to place his hand on mine, stopping my movements. I looked up, meeting his gaze, and saw the same conflicted emotions mirrored in his eyes. For a long moment, we just stood there, the silence between us, thick and heavy, filled with all the things we hadn't said. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I can't keep going on like this. It's tearing me apart." The vulnerability in his voice broke something inside me, and I felt a rush of emotions flood through me. Love, guilt, fear. I wanted to reach out to hold him, to reassure him that everything would be okay, but the words caught in my throat. I knew deep down that there was no easy way out of this, no way to erase what we'd done. "Lara," I murmured, my voice trembling, "we can't keep doing this. It's not right." He nodded, his hand still resting on mine, his gaze intense. "I know, but it's like I can't stop every time I try to put distance between us. I end up wanting to be closer. I don't know what to do." I pulled my hand back, feeling the cold air rush in where his warmth had been a reminder of the distance that needed to be between us. Maybe we need some space," I said, hating the way the words tasted in my mouth. "Maybe it's the only way to stop this. Before it gets worse," he looked at me, his eyes filled with a pain that cut straight to my core. "If that's what you want, Mom, if that's what you think is best." I wanted to tell him that it wasn't what I wanted, that it was the last thing I wanted. But I knew it was the only choice we had. We couldn't keep going like this, couldn't keep pretending that we could hide from the truth. The weight of what we'd done was too heavy, too dangerous, and I knew that if we didn't stop now, we'd lose everything. The following days were some of the hardest I'd ever endured. Lara and I avoided each other, each of us retreating into our own world, the silence between us louder than any words could ever be. I felt his absence like a physical ache, a hollow emptiness that reminded me of all the things we'd lost. And yet I knew that this was the only way, the only chance we had to move forward. One evening, I was sitting alone in the living room. Ethan returned home earlier than usual. He stared at me, his eyes keen and his countenance enigmatic. There was an unsaid tension between us, and I could feel my pulse racing as he moved up and took a seat next to me. "We need to speak," he replied, his tone firm but chilly. "I know something's been going on, and I think it's time we stopped pretending that everything's fine." My stomach dropped a wave of panic washing over me. I knew he didn't know the truth, not the whole truth at least, but the way he looked at me told me that he suspected something, that he was no longer willing to turn a blind eye to the cracks in our marriage. "I know I've been distant." He continued, his gaze fixed on the floor, but I thought we were strong enough to make it through. "I assumed you'd still be here waiting for me, but maybe I was mistaken." His remark struck me like a punch in the stomach, reminding me of all the ways our relationship had broken down. Of all the things I'd given up in the name of love, I wanted to tell him the truth, confess everything, put all my faults out in front of him, and ask his forgiveness. But I could not. The truth was too messy, too painful, and I knew that if I told him, it would destroy us both. "Ethan, I don't know what to say." I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean for things to end up like this. I didn't want." He looked at me, his gaze hard and unyielding. "Maybe that's the problem," he said, his voice filled with a bitterness I'd never heard before. "Maybe we stopped wanting each other a long time ago, and neither of us was willing to admit it." The silence that followed was deafening, a painful reminder of all the things we'd left unsaid, of all the ways we'd drifted apart. I knew that our marriage was over, that there was no way to salvage what we'd lost. And in that moment, I felt a strange sense of relief, a release from the chains that had bound me to a life I no longer wanted. In the days after, Ethan and I went through the process of separating. There were attorneys, papers, and lengthy discussions that seemed more like negotiations than anything else. It was dirty, terrible, but also liberating. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe and finally be myself, even if it meant beginning anew alone. Lara and I continued to keep our distance, both of us knowing that the line we'd crossed could never be uncrossed. There were no more stolen glances, no more whispered confessions in the dark. We'd made our choice, and now we had to live with it. Months passed each day, a step further away from the life I'd once known. I moved to a smaller house, one that was mine alone, a place where I could rebuild, where I could find peace. It was strange being alone after so many years, but it was also a relief, a chance to start over without the weight of the past dragging me down. One evening, I sat on the porch of my new house, watching the sun set over the horizon. I felt a feeling of serenity come over me, despite the errors I'd done and the decisions that had brought me here. They were a part of me and my experience, but they did not define me. I was prepared to go ahead, to let go of the past and embrace the future, whatever it held. And the last beams of sunshine faded into darkness. I had a peculiar feeling of optimism, a faint, fragile hope that someday I might find serenity. The trip ahead was unclear and full of unknowns, but for the first time in a long time, I felt prepared to face them.